All right, so buckle up, everybody, because we're diving deep into the mind of Edgar Allan Poe with his short story, Berenice. We're talking obsession, madness, and, well, let's just say teeth are never going to look the same. We're really lucky to have our expert here to help us unpack all the dark and twisted details that make Poe the master of the macabre, right?
He really does know how to take something so ordinary, like you said, and make it, well, kind of creepy. And Berenice, yeah, that's a perfect example. Poe just throws us right into the deep end, right from the first line when he introduces us to our narrator, Aegeus.
And Aegeus, he's a piece of work, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's obsessed with knowledge, yeah, but not in, like, a good way, not in a way that brings him any joy, you know? It's more like he's drowning in his own thoughts. What do you think Poe is trying to tell us with a character like that?
Well, Aegeus, he isn't a straightforward narrator at all. We call him an unreliable narrator in the biz. Poe uses this technique on purpose. I
Yeah.
mean, it creates this feeling of unease and distrust right away. It's like when you're reading, it feels like you're peeking directly into Aegeus's mind, but you can never be quite sure what's real and what's, all in his head.
Yeah, and that just makes it even creepier as the story goes on. You start to question, like, everything you read. It's almost like Poe is toying with us, the readers, challenging us to figure out what's really going on. And I gotta say, that's half the fun of reading Poe. But before we get too deep into Aegeus's mind, let's talk about Berenice. She seems to be the opposite of Aegeus in a lot of ways.
Yeah, totally different. Aegeus is all gloomy and trapped in those morbid thoughts. But Berenice, she's full of life, grace, beauty, everything Aegeus isn't. I think she's a really interesting character because she represents such a stark contrast to all that darkness in Aegeus's mind. It's like Poe is saying, hey, look at all the good things in life that you're missing out on.
Yeah, she's like the symbol of vitality that he just can't tap into because he's so stuck in his own head. And to make matters worse, her very existence just seems to fuel his obsession even more.
And then, of course, she gets sick. And this illness that takes over Berenice just completely changes her. It's like she's a shell of who she used to be. And that transformation, that adds another layer to her symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
Is she really just a character? Or is she something more? Maybe she represents how fragile beauty is, or even like the fleeting nature of life.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that sticks with you as you get further into the story.
Classic Poe. He's a master of using symbolism and allegory to really get under your skin. And speaking of getting under your skin, let's talk about this monomania that takes a hold of Aegeus. What is that exactly?
Basically, it's like an obsession with one thing and one thing only. But with Aegeus, it's way more than just a simple obsession. It completely takes over his entire being. Poe says it's this intense fixation on details that most people would never even notice, like a random shadow or a sound, maybe a smell. But in Aegeus's mind, these little details, they become huge. They become like twisted and sinister and super disturbing.
And we see this happen in the story, right? Like, he'll just get fixated on the flame of a lamp or some random pattern he sees on the wall. It's like everyday things just turn, I don't know, kind of scary and warped.
Exactly. Because what's scarier than the ordinary becoming terrifying,
Right.
right? Poe is playing with this idea that horror doesn't have to be some obvious grotesque thing. Sometimes it's even scarier when something familiar is twisted into something unsettling, something you don't understand. And those everyday objects, they make the idea that literally anything can become the object of an obsession hit way closer to home.
Yeah, that's a pretty scary thought. And it makes you realize that this could happen to anyone, right? It's like that old saying, the devil is in the details. But in this case, it's like the horror is in the details.
You could say that, yeah. And this is where Berenice takes that turn, into really unsettling territory. It's not just like the obsession itself. It's what Aegeus becomes fixated on, Berenice's teeth.
This is classic Poe. He can take something as simple as, teeth, something we all have, and he turns them into something truly creepy. Why teeth, though? What do you think he's doing there?
It is interesting when you think about it. The teeth become this huge symbol in the story. On one hand, they represent things like mortality and decay, the body breaking down, but they also hold this weird kind of allure for Aegeus. They get all tangled up with his obsession with Berenice herself.
And the way Poe describes them, it's almost like you can feel that smooth enamel and those sharp edges. Just reading it makes me want to, like, go schedule an extra cleaning.
Right. It's that vivid sensory language he uses that makes it so real.
Right.
You end up feeling like you're experiencing that obsession right alongside Aegeus. And it's important to remember that we're seeing everything through his eyes. His perceptions are totally unreliable.
Yeah, and that makes you wonder how much of what we're reading is actually happening and how much is just like his monomania messing with his mind. It's like being stuck in a nightmare, but you can't wake up. And the monster is, your own mind.
That's a great way to put it.
But even with all that, the ending of Berenice still manages to be really shocking, wouldn't you say?
It really does. And of course, Poe wouldn't be Poe if he didn't leave us with a bunch of unanswered questions.
It's so
He
true.
leaves us to put all the pieces together ourselves. We have these fragmented memories, these horrible implications.
Hmm.
And it's that ambiguity that makes the story stay with you long after you've finished reading it.
You're left with this lingering feeling of dread. Like something really awful happened, but you're not sure exactly what. What do you make of that choice? I mean, as someone who's, spent so much time with Poe's work.
I think Poe knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the power of suggestion. Sometimes what we imagine is way scarier than anything someone could actually write down.
Yeah.
By leaving those gaps in the story, he lets us, the readers, fill them in with our own fears.
It's like he's saying, here are all the ingredients, now go make your own nightmare.
Exactly. That's a big part of what makes Poe such a master of psychological horror, wouldn't you say? He doesn't just tell us a scary story. He makes us face that darkness inside ourselves. He makes us complicit in the horror. And that's unsettling, yeah, but also really powerful for the reader.
It really is, and I think that's what makes Berenice so effective. And, Poe's work in general, he takes these really dark parts of, like, human nature obsession, madness that pull toward the morbid, and he makes us look at them. It's not always fun, but it definitely makes you think.
I agree. And it's even more unsettling because Poe doesn't give us any easy answers. There's no nice little moral at the end, no sense of, like, justice or that everything's wrapped up. You're just left with these awful implications. And that can be a truly haunting feeling. You know what I mean?
It really is. It's like he's holding up this mirror and saying, hey, this could be you. What if you were the one so obsessed?
Mm.
And that's a question that really stays with you, even after you're done reading.
Yeah, it does. And that's the arc of good writing. It makes you think critically, challenge what you think you know, and deal with, all the complicated parts of being human, even the dark, disturbing parts.
Absolutely. So before we let you go, we always like to end with a question. We spent all this time talking about obsession and how Poe explores it in Berenice, but what about you? Have you ever been weirdly drawn to something, an object, a sound, an idea, whatever, that you just couldn't explain?
Hmm. I'm sure we all have at some point, right? Those weird little fixations we get, those little details that just grab our attention. For me, I think it'd be old maps, something about the details and the faded lines. They have this sense of history and exploration that I love. It's so easy to just get lost in them, thinking about the journeys they represent, the stories they tell.
Oh, I can totally see that. I can practically picture you now, punched over some ancient map, tracing your fingers along the lines,
Yeah, maybe.
lost in your own little world. And hey, you know what? That's not creepy at all. That's just good old-fashioned curiosity. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive before we both fall down a rabbit hole of literary analysis.
Probably good idea.
Well, thanks for walking us through, Berenice. It's been, well, a journey, to say the least.
It has.
And we hope you've all enjoyed this little trip into the dark side of literature. Until next time, happy reading, everybody.